It's Christmas time and you know what that means. Oh, touch-up time. As I like the tree this year will be a charm.
That musical introduction was composed and performed by a machine in a project from OpenAI called Jukebox that was unveiled in April of 2020. As you could hear and see from the audience response on SoundCloud, it's not likely that you're going to be hearing it on the radio, except maybe as an object of ridicule or parody. But the achievement is actually quite impressive from a technological point of view. In the first seconds of the video, you were listening to a machine perform in the manner of Frank Sinatra. And the kinship was quite recognizable. How did Jukebox do it? They used 1.2 million songs, half of which were English, as a training set. They were able to cluster these by type, classical in one corner, reggae in another, jazz and pop in others, and so on. And they trained models based on this rich data set so that they could capture and model songs. That's an oversimplification, of course, but you can read the paper that they published on their website. The AI Frank Sinatra isn't likely to get any sort of lucrative record deal, but there are some people who have made some money on AI-produced artwork. In 2018, Christie's auctioned off the portrait of Edward Bellamy for a price of $432,500. It was the first such high-dollar sale of an artwork that was produced using artificial intelligence. They used GANs, or generative adversarial networks, that are commonly used in AI. The piece was produced by a group called Obvious that was composed of 3 quite young friends, students actually. They had tried to sell artworks on eBay before, but were unsuccessful. Like the Jukebox Frank Sinatra, the machine learning approach that the group took required large amounts of data. And in this case, they had images pre-curated and downloadable from GitHub. The images were used as inputs for the GANs, and the image emerged from the activity and the interaction of the generative networks. The group, Obvious, innovated by printing off the image and including the GAN algorithm, which is by Ian Goodfellow, as a signature. So who gets credit? That's a question that's been argued about. Who's the creator of the work? And maybe it doesn't matter to Christie's, but as I searched for an image of the piece and I found it, I learned that I didn't need to worry too much about ownership. The Wikimedia Commons supplied a high-resolution copy and reassured me, saying, this file is in the public domain because, as the work of a computer algorithm or artificial intelligence, it has no human author in whom copyright is vested. The Jukebox creations and the $432,500 GAN-produced artwork show some of the interesting and innovative power of artificial intelligence. These examples are flashy, of course, but in their own ways, they also cast some light on what we mean by art and creativity. How do they relate to being human if art and creativity can appear to emerge from computer hardware or software? I can't help but wonder what Martin Heidegger would have thought. He believed that fine art was a way to reveal outside of the limits of modern technology. But in the cases of Jukebox and Obvious, it's not clear at all that fine art breaks free of the bonds of modern technology. After all, both use what Heidegger would have called standing reserve as a fundamental source of their art. The press of technology has been felt on the boundaries of art before. In 1935, Walter Benjamin considered the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. And he quoted Paul Valéry, who wrote some years before in the 20s. Valéry wrote, "We must expect great innovations to transform the entire technique of the arts, thereby affecting artistic creation itself, and perhaps even bringing about an amazing change in our very notion of art."
Sonar for us. So in a way, we wanted to completely change the roles in the sense that the machine is doing all the creative part of the whole project, and me as a human artist, I'm only the executor. So we're trying to put everything upside down in a sense. Well, as a researcher, I'm really interested in a field of research that it's called computational creativity, which basically means that we're trying to describe what it means creativity from a human perspective and translate it into the computational world. The day that I found what Mario was being able to produce with his algorithms, and that was the first time that I thought, wow. I'm Mario.
Alberto Barqué-Duran switched places with machines in order to study how creativity and humanity fit together. He became the executor, as he said, and the machine did the creative part of the project, which was indebted to work that Mario Klingemann had done with AI. A similar switch of roles happened in a Russian creative design group, which began offering design products by Nikolay Ivanov. These were very successful, and Ivanov's work appeared on beer bottles and other product labels, clothing, everywhere, as one designer said. "He's breaking new ground," one said. "He's not afraid of criticism. He doesn't think like a human."
Николай Аронов – это не человек.
Мы создали искусственный дизайнерский интеллект.
Он может создать бесконечное количество логотипов, и все, что тебе нужно сделать, выбрать идеально.
The conventional lines that we draw between human beings and machines seem to be fading, or at least being moved around. Part of the issue may be that we don't yet have a language to describe the differences of works produced by machines and those by humans. The concepts that help us understand innovation and creativity haven't quite been able to distinguish newness from human minds and newness from machines. Finding that vocabulary and those concepts will help us perhaps understand what art and creativity are in a much deeper way. The language problem has been around for a while. Decades ago, John McCarthy, the fellow who incidentally coined the term artificial intelligence, claimed that even machines as simple as thermostats can be said to have beliefs. Philosopher John Searle, a skeptic of that, in response asked, "What beliefs does your thermostat have?" McCarthy responded, "My thermostat has 3 beliefs. It's too hot in here, it's too cold in here, and it's just right in here." Of the exchange, Neil Postman, who was certainly not a big fan of technology, wrote, "What is significant about this response is that it has redefined the meaning of the word belief. The remark rejects the view that humans have internal states of mind that are the foundation of belief." Postman is right, it seems to me. But in some matters, perhaps those not necessarily relating to thermostats, we find it very difficult to use exact terms, since sometimes those words are not on hand. They're not suited to describe the nuances and the new things that we confront. Sometimes perhaps the word doesn't exist that fits a specific context. And we use whatever word we can to describe something in a metaphor. And we hope that the listener might see the metaphor and not completely misunderstand it. An example. Listen to Mario Klingemann talk about artistic innovation and creativity in this short introduction of himself and the project that he was doing with barqué-duran. He is, in some sense, hemmed in by the vocabulary, and he has to talk metaphorically about the activities in his project, which are driven by machine learning approaches. The metaphor he uses applies conventional language of art and creativity to AI and to machine learning. He perhaps has little other choice than to use that vocabulary, since we currently don't have solid concepts and clear words that distinguish machine-produced activities that look like art and creativity from art and creativity that comes from human beings.
I'm Mario Klingemann. I'm an artist and I work with data and algorithms and increasingly with neural networks and artificial intelligence to generate visuals that look like art. This is a project, a collaboration. I do it with barqué-duran. So the computer generates a random pose, and the pose gets translated into something like a rudimentary proto-image. Some of them are more taken into account the overall setting, let's say landscape, room, or others are really more like a very blurry, blobby pose. Then in the next step, it can take one of those and run a step of style transfer over it, which produces something that looks like this. For example, definitely more expressionism, I guess. Last step that I call transenhancement, it takes this small image and tries to scale it up to the big format. And there's of course some difficulty in that because it has to invent new information, because a single pixel suddenly can become 1,000 pixels or 200 by 200 pixels, depending on the size you want to do. So the model has to make up what is going on in that single pixel. And I did that by training it on blurry images, because if you have a blurred image, also a lot of information gets lost. So because it has seen so many examples of pairs of blurred and original images, it tried to make up its own mind, you could say, about what ways are there to turn a certain wake shape into something more concrete. And that's where it starts generating some interesting artifacts, which at least I have not seen them in a photo or a painting. They are these hybrids between something that looks painterly, but at the same time it has a machine character. I'm very interested in seeing like how this will transfer to that, like what will get added, what will stay, what gets lost. So, well, we will see in 3 days, right? Then it's done.
Of course, not everything about the relationship of technology and art and creativity is so dramatic or high relief as Klingemann's work, or the use of AI in music production by Jukebox, or logo designs by Iranov, the AI guy. It's probably the case that these use cases are actually edge cases for the relationship of technology and art. Most of the relationship of technology and human creativity comes from novel uses of technology that are far less dramatic. Here, technology certainly shapes human decisions and provides an impetus for ingenuity, but the challenge or the potential conflict of technology against humanity and vice versa is either absent or certainly less pronounced. One of the resources for this section of the course is a short documentary film from Ruth Dusseault called Ecotopia. The conversation that follows serves as an introduction to that film and to the filmmaker. We'll watch the film for class, and the artist will be one of our special guests. what you've done, especially in Ecotopia, is show the kind of convergence of people together to rethink the way that societies are, and it's an enormously creative kind of approach to life, and it actually is infused with technologies.
And technology is infused with the utopian ideas. I think all of the things that all of the things that a documentary filmmaker covers is available to anyone, but the avenue in which they enter it is the filmmaker's contribution, And so my avenue has always been kind of a utopian expressions, because they're microcosms of the time in which they are created. America has more utopian experimental communities than any country in the world. Thomas More, I suppose, was in the Middle Ages, but, you can go back to, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. It was written during the Age of Exploration, and it was a reflection of the public imagination during the age in which we didn't know what was beyond the horizon, and they imagined all sorts of strange beings, What I like about this particular project is that it caught the attention of somebody in a computer science department. And I have, as I wrote you in the email, this film has screened in a political science program, in an architecture program, in engineering, in art departments. I am very proud of that. Especially with this separating of minds that the internet seems to be creating. Everyone is sort of going into their little pockets of interest and staying there. I'm very proud that that's something that I make is appealing to other disciplines, But this is the start of it. In 2006 was Fred Turner's From Cyberculture to Counterculture. From counterculture to cyberculture, and which he defines digital utopianism. It's basically the idea of the film, because he inspired a lot of other writers and a lot of curators and artists to try and redefine the counterculture in this time. So let me read this one paragraph.
Okay,
I think it'll be a good place to start. The internet was about to flatten organizations, globalize society, decentralize control, and help harmonize people, as MIT's Nicholas Negroponte put it. He's the one that started the Media Lab. The stodgy men in gray flannel suits who had so confidently roamed the corridors of industry would shortly disappear, and so too would the chains of command on which their authority depended. In their place, wrote Negroponte and dozens of others, the internet would bring about the rise of a new digital generation. Playful, self-sufficient, psychologically whole. And it would see that generation gather, like the net itself, into collaborative networks of independent peers. States, too, would melt away, their citizens lured back from archaic party-based politics to the natural agora of the digitized marketplace. Even the individual self, so long trapped in the human body, would finally be free to step outside its fleshy confines, explore its authentic interests, and find others with whom it might achieve communion. That's a good description of the digital utopianism that I was wondering about. This is all this scholarship is set in the 1970s. And I was teaching a summer class at Stanford, in a photography class one summer. And I also wanted to do some filming in the Bay Area. And while I was there, I met Fred Turner, and I wanted to visit some of the early communes that he had written about. And so I went up to Sebastopol and Sonoma Valley, and expecting to find a bunch of old hippies. But instead, I found young people, and they were wired. They had solar-powered internet transponders, and they were downloading all of the videos you need to survive in the wilderness. And I thought, well, that's just a Bay Area thing. Maybe it's just there because that's where Silicon Valley is. But the more I researched it, the more I started to look at intentional communities everywhere, and they're all wired. And a lot of them were people who were the first generations to graduate into the Great Recession. And so they were too smart to be busboys in the city. And they got online, and through social networks and databases, they just found each other in these places in the middle of nowhere and just sort of started to hang out. It was almost, some of them were in refuge.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The in your essay, one of the things that I noticed was that so many of these new utopians were out of information technology and had maybe computer science backgrounds, or were programmers, or very skilled in that kind of work. Was there, talk a little bit about sort of the roots of that. You mentioned open source, and open source being sort of a key value.
Yeah. I think after the countercultural movement, historically in Silicon Valley, when utopia ended, and it was just sort of, Haight-Ashbury had turned into a sort of a problem area with a lot of drug addiction and things like that, and the communalists had long left, and the communalists were fading. The person that Fred Turner writes about, his central character, of course, is Stuart Brand, who wrote the Whole Earth catalog, and I'll pick it up in a second and show it to your camera. But he, I mean, it was all about getting tools of his market for that catalog was the communalists, and eventually it became the Whole Earth Software Review. Because Stuart Brand gave up on farming and started, of course, investing early on in the internet, and was considered sort of the new radicals were the hackers, the people who were trying to keep the internet free. And that idea of free things comes from the countercultural movement in Haight-Ashbury and Oakland, of radical groups like the Diggers, who opened like a free food shop or free bicycles. And you see that descended through corporate structures to things like car sharing and scooter sharing. The idea something is free, this feeling of sharing, the sharing economy that we have now. It's not that gentle. It's a bit of, in some ways, it's a form of serfdom. If you look at if you interview the, Uber drivers and stuff, they're not making a living. But the idea of it surpassing the traditional corporate hierarchical structure and becoming a more egalitarian economic form in which anybody can be a taxi driver.
There would be other ways that you could actually look at the emergence of these kind of communities. You chose, I think, a journalistic and an artistic approach. Why?
Well, I'm an essayist, and when I do gallery exhibitions, I do multi-channel projections. But I also do single channel films, and an essay, as I described in my classes, I use Aldous Huxley's definition of what an essay is, which he wrote for his introduction of essays. It has three components: something personal and subjective, and then it has something, something of very intense personal interest, and then it has to have something objective. This is concrete, external information, something journalistic, fact-based, didactic. And the third component is abstraction, or something like poetry, art, mythology, something that involves high-level geometric thinking. Okay. And those three components will surround a topic in a panoramic way, but because they're oddly shaped, they leave these crevices for experimental thoughts to wander in and out. You know, and I think that it's very useful for exposing nuances to topics that might otherwise seem finite, you know, that might otherwise seem conclusive.
One of the assignments in the class, by the way, is what are called technobiographies. And these are short reflective essays that really explore the way that the individual students have fought with, adopted, incorporated technological products or technologies within their lives. And they may choose to do it not so much for their own personal narrative. They may want to make it a more of a historical analysis of my family's first car, or when my mom and dad got the first television, something like that. I got
my relationship with my phone.
That's the one that I'm expecting to see a lot of.
A lot.
But you know, I had a nice conversation with John Lutz, who's at the University of Victoria. He did the similar kind of assignment, only he called it autobiographies. It was in a course on the car, and he said during that exchange that he thought that the automobile was the major, if not the most important technology of the 20th century. And then he said as an aside, and the smartphone is for the 21st. And I think he's probably right. And
yeah. I mean, the part of the reason that I filmed the way I do, a critic one time called it slow form journalism, and it's characterized by sort of a return to description that you would find in observational cinema, a period of embeddedness where I would decide to either spend a week with somebody rather than an hour, you know, to just grab the story and go. It's a very different report when you spend a week with somebody, or when you return to them over time. And then the last thing is what happens is that you end up reporting, you know, communion over judgment, you know. And so that's why these projects that I have take years, because there doesn't seem to be a lot of reportage. I mean, some reporters are very, very responsible and doing an excellent job. I shouldn't say that, but and those reporters are almost like my artists now. You know, I'm fans of journalists because I feel like they're doing things that the art world might not want to even go into. I don't call myself a journalist because I believe journalism acts in an arena of law. But I do want to capture the conversation as opposed to the judgment.
That came clear in the film. It was actually quite a refreshing approach. That, in a sense, the people and the circumstances spoke very clearly. And I was struck by the great diversity in the way that the communities felt. You had the agrarian utopians, and you had then this sort of highly mechanistic, workshop kind of environment in another community. What did you particularly notice about the feel of the different communities?
Well, those last two, open source ecology, he's totally neoliberal. He's a total libertarian, and so is the people that he attracts. And he attracts a lot of software engineers because it's entitled open source ecology. but he's also very much fed by the idea of Jeremy Rifkin's economies of smallness. And but what's interesting about open source ecology is that it's in northern Missouri, and I went there twice and spent a week there each time. Their mission is a mechanized artisanship. So it's basically an artisanal sized economy, but it's still local and small scale. So they don't think that all machines are bad, of course, but their idea is to make the 50 machines necessary to start a small civilization. Let's make machines, but not make them giant. So it's a utopian thought process in which we can become industrial, but not too much. They are 2 hours away from the last group in the film, Dancing Rabbit. And Dancing Rabbit represents, probably most closely represents the original counterculturalists. They're very highly educated. A lot of them went to Stanford and Berkeley. The originators of Dancing Rabbit were computing majors at Stanford. And after graduation, they made a lot of money in the dot-com industries, working for startups in the 1990s in Palo Alto, and saved money to buy the land in Missouri. And they built this whole community from scratch with beautiful architecture, beautiful handmade architectures. And they're the ones that are really thinking about they're thinking the same way the counterculturalists did in the 1960s, in which they're trying to create a new politic. And they have nothing to say to their neighbors down the road making machines.